The storm wasn't just rain. It was a relentless, punishing deluge that turned the New Jersey highway into a river of asphalt, each raindrop hammering against the windshield of Elias's blue Kenworth like bullets from heaven. The wipers fought a losing battle against the furious wall of water, their rhythmic slapping the only sound competing with the diesel engine's growl as it pushed through the midnight darkness. Elias, a weathered 55-year-old veteran with calloused hands that had gripped steering wheels across 1,000,000 miles of American highway, squinted through the chaos ahead. His truck was more than machinery. It was his fortress of solitude, reeking of leather seats and stale coffee. The only home he'd known since his wife's death left him with nothing but the open road and a daughter he barely saw between runs. He preferred the night shift. Darkness hid the monotony and let him wrestle with thoughts that were sometimes more dangerous than black ice. Tonight, he was hauling electronics from Baltimore to Boston, hoping to make his delivery window and get back to Texas before his daughter's soccer game next weekend. But this biblical downpour was forcing him to crawl at 45 miles per hour on a highway built for 70. Suddenly, his xenon headlights carved through the storm like twin swords, illuminating something that made his veteran heart skip a beat. About 200 yards ahead, on the narrow, muddy shoulder barely wide enough for a bicycle, two silhouettes moved like ghosts against the tempest. Not animals, not a breakdown, people walking in this hell. Elias's jaw clenched, his trucker instincts screaming the same warning that had kept him alive through decades on America's loneliest roads. Don't stop. It's a trap. He'd heard enough horror stories about highway robberies where desperate people use decoys to steal cargo, trucks, or worse. His boots stayed planted on the accelerator, determined to blast past whatever sob story was playing out on that shoulder. But as the Kenworth roared closer, his headlights revealed a detail that shattered every defensive wall he'd built around his heart. The smaller figure, a young woman barely out of her teens, turned toward his approaching lights. She didn't wave for help or motion for him to stop. She simply looked back with an expression of absolute terror, clutching something against her chest like it was pure gold while keeping one protective hand on the arm of the elderly woman beside her. That's when Elias saw her companion clearly. A frail, 91-year-old woman in nothing but a stained white tank top, her thin arms exposed to the storm, her shock of white hair plastered to her skull. Her weathered face held the kind of dignity that only comes from surviving decades of hardship, but her eyes reflected the same terror as her granddaughter's. A jolt of electricity shot down Elias's spine. He cursed loud enough to wake the dead, slammed his palm against the steering wheel, and hit the air brakes. The high-pitched hiss and screech of tires on wet asphalt shattered the storm's symphony as 80,000 pounds of steel began to slow, grinding to a halt about 50 yards past the two women. Elias sat in his cab, engine idling, knowing he'd either just made the biggest mistake of his night or the best decision of his life. Through his side mirror, he watched as the younger woman helped the elderly one shuffle toward his truck, both moving like they were carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. When they reached his passenger window, Elias rolled it down just a crack, keeping the engine running and his hand near the gear shift, ready to flee if this was some elaborate con. But when he looked into their faces through the rain-streaked glass, what he saw wasn't deception. It was desperation so pure it could have cut diamond. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going. The younger woman reached his window first, her face a map of exhaustion and mud. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who'd aged years in a single day. "Sir, please," she called through the storm, rain streaming down her cheeks like tears. "We're not asking for money. We just need to get somewhere dry. My grandmother can't walk much further." Elias studied them through the rain-streaked glass. The old woman stood behind her granddaughter, swaying slightly on her feet but maintaining a posture that spoke of decades spent refusing to bow to hardship. Her thin white hair was plastered to her skull, and that stained tank top clung to her frail frame like wet tissue paper. But it was her eyes that got him. They held no self-pity, just the quiet determination of someone who'd survived the Depression, probably raised children during wartime, and wasn't about to give up now. Against every instinct screaming in his veteran brain, Elias reached over and unlocked the passenger door. "Get in quick," he growled, his voice rougher than he intended. "Both of you." The younger woman, barely 20, he realized now, helped her grandmother climb into the high cab. It was a real ordeal for them, weak and slippery from the mud, but they managed it with a grace that spoke of practice helping each other through hard times. When they finally settled into the space behind the seats, the smell of dampness and fear filled what Elias had always considered his sanctuary. He cranked the heat up high and put the truck back in gear, merging onto the black road. The silence in the cab was thick, broken only by the hum of the heater and the old woman's shallow breathing. Elias could feel their eyes on his profile, studying the stranger who'd just become their salvation. The old woman was the first to speak, her voice carrying the musical cadence of old New England. "I'm Martha Blackwood," she said, extending a weathered hand toward him. "This is my granddaughter, Clara. We're grateful beyond words for your kindness, young man." Young man. Elias almost smiled despite himself. It had been decades since anyone called him young. "Elias Morrison," he replied, glancing at them in his rearview mirror. "And you don't look like you're dressed for a midnight stroll. What were you doing out there?" Clara shifted uncomfortably, clutching what looked like a heavy canvas bag against her chest. "We were walking to our cousin's place in Bridgeport," she said quietly. "It's about 40 miles from where you found us." Elias raised an eyebrow. 40 miles? In this weather? You'd have been dead before sunrise. Martha's chin lifted with that dignified defiance he was beginning to recognize. "We've survived worse storms than this, Mr. Morrison." Both literal and figurative. Something in her tone made Elias look at them more carefully. These weren't just two women caught in bad weather. They had the hollowed-out look of people who'd lost everything, but they carried themselves with too much pride to be professional victims. "When's the last time either of you ate?" he asked. Clara's stomach answered for her with a growl that filled the cab. Martha shot her a look, but Elias was already reaching for his cooler. "Here," he said, pulling out a thermos and a paper bag. "Hot coffee and some sandwiches I packed this morning. Go ahead." Clara looked at the food like it was pure gold, but she didn't take it for herself. With trembling hands, she unscrewed the thermos lid and offered it to Martha first, then broke the sandwich in half, giving her grandmother the larger portion. That small act, putting family first when your own hunger was eating you alive, earned them immediate respect from Elias, who'd spent too many years surrounded by selfishness at truck stops and loading docks. "So what's really going on?" Elias asked after they'd eaten in grateful silence. "People don't walk 40 miles in a storm unless they're running from something or toward something pretty important." Clara and Martha exchanged a look that carried the weight of shared trauma. Finally, Clara cleared her throat. "We got evicted this morning," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "From our family home in Connecticut. Been in our family for over a century." Martha's weathered hands tightened into fists. "Stolen is more accurate," she said, her voice carrying steel beneath the genteel accent. "That developer, Sterling Vance, claimed we defaulted on property taxes that were paid in full. Had sheriff's deputies at our door at 6 this morning with fraudulent paperwork. We tried to fight it," Clara continued, "but Vance had lawyers and we had." She gestured to the canvas bag. "Whatever we could grab before they locked us out. Everything else. Furniture, photos, Grandpa's tools, my books. All of it's gone." Elias felt his jaw tighten. He'd heard stories like this before. Predators who targeted elderly property owners with fake legal documents and corrupt local officials. What about family? Friends? Someone who could help? "My cousin Sarah in Bridgeport said we could stay with her temporarily," Clara said. "But she's got 4 kids in a 2-bedroom apartment. We didn't want to be a burden, but we had nowhere else to go." Martha straightened in her seat. "We're not charity cases, Mr. Morrison. Clara here has been managing our farm's books and local delivery contracts since she was 16. She's got a head for business that would shame most college graduates. And I've been running households and small enterprises since before you were born. We just need a chance to get back on our feet." Elias glanced at Clara in his mirror, really seeing her for the first time. Despite the mud and exhaustion, there was something sharp and calculating in her eyes. The look of someone who'd been forced to grow up fast and had risen to the challenge. What kind of delivery contracts? Local farms to restaurants and markets, Clara said, warming to the subject. I built routes that cut travel time by 30% and eliminated waste. Turned a struggling farm into the most efficient operation in 3 counties. Her voice carried quiet pride. Until Vance decided our land was worth more than our lives. Martha nodded approvingly. The girl has a gift for logistics, can look at a map and see inefficiencies that would take others weeks to spot. Something clicked in Elias's brain. He'd been struggling for months with his own route management, trying to maximize profits while minimizing deadhead miles. His paperwork was a disaster, his scheduling haphazard. He was a good driver but a terrible businessman, and it was slowly killing his bottom line. Tell me something, he said, pulling into a truck stop. What would you do with a driver who's hauling electronics from Baltimore to Boston, but instead of picking up a return load in Boston, he's driving empty back to Texas because he can't figure out how to coordinate backhauls? Clara was quiet for a moment, her mind clearly working. What's his typical turnaround time? 72 hours from departure to return. And he's losing money on fuel and time for the empty return trip? Every single run. Clara leaned forward, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He needs to coordinate with regional distributors. Boston's got textile mills that ship raw materials south, and there's always manufacturing equipment moving from Massachusetts to Texas. A good logistics coordinator could line up backhauls that would cut his turnaround to 48 hours and double his profit margin. Elias felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't just book smarts. Clara was describing exactly the solutions he'd been too proud or too stubborn to figure out himself. How would you find those backhauls? Database analysis, relationship building with dispatchers, understanding seasonal shipping patterns, Clara said, her voice gaining confidence. Most independent drivers are terrible at networking. They see other truckers as competition instead of potential partners for load sharing and route optimization. Martha watched this exchange with approval. I told you she had a gift. Elias pulled into a parking space and killed the engine. The sudden silence was deafening. For the first time in years, he was faced with a decision that could change everything. His original plan was to drop them at their cousin's place and continue with his life of solitary highways and empty conversations with dispatchers. But something about these 2 women had awakened a part of him he thought had died with his wife. I've got a proposition, he said slowly. I own a small ranch in Maryland. Nothing fancy, just a farmhouse and some outbuildings on 20 acres. It's been sitting mostly empty since my wife died, and I spend maybe 10 days a month there between runs. He paused, hardly believing what he was about to say. What would you say to helping me turn my struggling trucking operation into something that actually makes money? In exchange for a place to live and a chance to build something new. Clara's eyes widened. You're offering us a home? I'm offering you a partnership, Elias corrected. I need someone who understands logistics, and from what I can tell, you need someone who owns equipment and has an established customer base. Martha, you'd have your own space and the security of knowing no developer can touch you there. Martha studied him with those sharp eyes that had seen decades of men making promises they couldn't keep. Why would you do this for strangers? Elias was quiet for a long moment, watching rain streak down the windshield. Because I've been driving these roads for 20 years, and I've never seen anyone who looked more like they belonged somewhere than you 2 looked like you belonged in that farmhouse you lost. Maybe it's time I stopped running from everything and started building something that matters. The silence stretched between them, filled with possibility and risk. Finally, Martha reached over and squeezed Clara's hand. What do you think, dear? Clara looked at the canvas bag in her lap, then at Elias. We're not looking for charity, Mr. Morrison. If we do this, it's as equal partners. We pull our weight, we contribute our skills, and we build something together. Elias smiled for the first time in months. Wouldn't have it any other way. He started the engine and pulled back onto the highway, but instead of heading north toward Boston, he took the southbound ramp toward Maryland. In his mirrors, he could see Clara and Martha holding hands, their faces reflecting a mixture of hope and terror, the look of people who'd lost everything and were brave enough to risk building it back again. The storm was finally beginning to break, and through the gaps in the clouds, Elias could see the first hint of dawn on the horizon. For the first time since his wife's funeral, he wasn't driving toward just another delivery. He was driving toward home. The Morrison Ranch had been dying a slow death for 3 years. Elias pulled his Kenworth up the gravel drive as the first rays of morning sun broke through the storm clouds, illuminating a 2-story farmhouse that looked like it was slowly surrendering to grief. Paint peeled from the siding like old scabs, gutters sagged under the weight of accumulated leaves, and the wraparound porch that his wife had loved so much was littered with the detritus of a man who'd stopped caring about anything beyond his next delivery. Martha stepped down from the cab and stood perfectly still for a long moment, her weathered hands on her hips as she surveyed the property with the calculating eye of someone who'd spent decades making homes from houses. "Good bones," she said finally. "This place just needs to remember how to breathe again." Clara was already walking the perimeter, that sharp business mind cataloging possibilities. "The outbuildings are solid. We could convert that barn into office space for the logistics operation. And this house?" She paused on the front steps, testing the boards for rot. "This house was built by people who meant it to last." Elias felt something twist in his chest as he watched them see potential where he'd only seen reminders of loss. "It's been empty more than lived in since Sarah died," he admitted. "I kept meaning to fix things up, but every time I'd start a project, I'd remember her voice telling me I was doing it wrong, and I'd just stop." Martha turned to him with an expression that mixed sympathy with steel. "Well, we're here now, and we don't have the luxury of wallowing. Clara and I have work to do." What happened over the next 2 months was nothing short of miraculous. Martha attacked the house like a general planning a campaign, armed with scrub brushes and an inexhaustible supply of old-fashioned elbow grease. She stripped wallpaper that had been peeling for years, revealing hardwood walls that gleamed like honey once she'd finished with them. Clara tackled the business side with equal fervor, transforming Elias's cluttered spare bedroom into a nerve center of logistics coordination, complete with maps, charts, and a computer system that made his previous paper-based chaos look like cave paintings. The transformation wasn't just physical. For the first time in years, the house filled with voices other than the television. Martha humming old hymns as she worked, Clara on the phone negotiating backhaul contracts with a confidence that left veteran dispatchers scrambling to keep up. Elias found himself coming home earlier from runs, eager to see what they'd accomplished in his absence. But it was the evening routine that truly brought the house back to life. Martha insisted on cooking dinner for all 3 of them, treating Elias's protests about being a burden with the dismissive wave of someone who'd been feeding people longer than he'd been alive. Clara would spread her route optimization work across the kitchen table while Martha stirred pots on the stove, and Elias would find himself drawn into conversations about everything from fuel efficiency to the best way to restore the garden that Sarah had loved. "We're pulling 40% more profit per mile than we were 3 months ago," Clara announced one evening, sliding a spreadsheet across the table to Elias. "And I've got 3 other independent drivers asking if we can coordinate their routes too." Elias studied the numbers with amazement. "How did you?" "Database mining and relationship building," Clara said with a grin. "Turns out most shipping coordinators are just waiting for someone to make their jobs easier. I've been tracking seasonal patterns, building partnerships with regional distributors, and creating route-sharing networks that benefit everyone involved." Martha set a plate of pot roast in front of him. "The girls built us a proper business, Elias. Time you started thinking bigger than 1 truck and 1 driver." That's when Elias made the decision that would change everything. "What would you say to making this official? Morrison Family Logistics with all 3 of us as equal partners?" Clara's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "You'd really want us as full partners?" "I'd be crazy not to," Elias replied. "I provide the equipment and experience, you provide the brains and organization, and Martha provides He paused, looking at the woman who'd somehow turned his house of mourning back into a home. The wisdom to keep us all grounded. It was exactly 6 weeks later when their new life came under attack. Elias was checking tire pressure in the driveway when a black Mercedes sedan pulled up the gravel drive, followed by a white pickup truck with 2 men who looked like they'd been hired for their ability to intimidate rather than their conversational skills. A man in an expensive suit emerged from the Mercedes. Tall, thin, with the kind of artificial smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Morrison?" The man called out, his voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Sterling Vance, Tri-State Development Corporation. I believe you're harboring some individuals who are trespassing on my time." Elias felt his veteran instincts kick in immediately. This wasn't a social call or a business inquiry. This was a predator marking territory. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said carefully. "This is private property, and you're not welcome here." Vance's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "I'm talking about Martha Blackwood and her granddaughter. They're squatters who abandoned valuable property in Connecticut rather than face their legal obligations. Now they're hiding behind an innocent trucker who doesn't understand the situation he's walked into." The front door opened and Martha stepped onto the porch, Clara close behind her. Even from 50 feet away, Elias could see the old woman's spine stiffen with recognition and rage. "Sterling Vance," she said, her voice carrying across the yard like winter wind. "I should have known you'd come slithering around eventually." Vance gestured to his companions, who moved to flank him. "Mrs. Blackwood, you and your granddaughter need to come with me. There are legal issues to resolve, and your current living situation is irregular." "The hell it is," Elias said, moving to stand between Vance and the porch. "These women are residents of this property and partners in a legitimate business. You've got no authority here." "Actually," Vance said, pulling a manila folder from his car, "I have several legal documents that suggest otherwise. It seems your partners have outstanding debts and legal obligations that make their current living situation a form of fraud. I'd hate to see an honest businessman like yourself get caught up in their criminal activity." Clara stepped forward, her young face hard with anger. "Those documents are forgeries, just like the ones you used to steal our farm. We don't owe you anything except a reckoning for what you've done." One of Vance's companions, a thick-shouldered man with hands like anvils, cracked his knuckles. "Maybe the ladies need help understanding their situation," he said. That's when Elias felt 20 years of military training surge through his bloodstream. "Touch either of them and you'll be eating through a straw for the rest of your life," he said quietly. Vance raised a hand to calm his muscle. "No need for unpleasantness, Mr. Morrison. I'm simply here to collect what belongs to me and prevent you from making a terrible mistake. These women are professional con artists who target lonely truckers. They'll take everything you have and disappear in the night." Martha laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Is that what you tell yourself to sleep at night, Sterling? That everyone you've destroyed deserved it? I suggest you verify their story before you risk your livelihood protecting criminals," Vance said to Elias. "We'll be back in 48 hours with proper documentation. I'd advise you to reconsider your position before then." After they left, Elias spent the rest of the day on the phone with lawyers, spending money he didn't have on legal advice he hoped he'd never need. The attorney he finally hired, a sharp-eyed woman named Rebecca Torres who specialized in predatory developer cases, listened to Martha and Clara's story with growing anger. "This is a classic land grab scheme," Torres explained over speakerphone. "Vance targets elderly property owners with fabricated debt documents, then uses corrupt local officials to expedite evictions before anyone can challenge the paperwork. He's probably done this dozens of times." "What can we do?" Elias asked. "First, we file protective papers establishing Martha and Clara as legal residents of your property. Second, we request full discovery on Vance's Connecticut operation. And third," Torres paused, "we prepare for him to escalate. Men like Vance don't take no for an answer." The protective papers cost Elias $3,000, most of his emergency savings, but Torres assured him they were bulletproof. Martha was officially documented as a senior dependent resident, Clara as a business partner in Morrison Family Logistics, and both women as legal tenants with full rights under Maryland state law. 2 days later, Vance returned with a vengeance. Elias was in the barn converting space for their expanded logistics operation when he heard the rumble of heavy machinery coming up the drive. Through the barn doors, he watched in disbelief as a bulldozer rolled onto his property, followed by Vance's Mercedes and a Maryland State Police cruiser. A uniformed deputy emerged from the police car, a young man who looked uncomfortable with whatever he'd been told to do. Vance was already striding toward the house, waving a folder of documents and talking loudly about emergency possession orders and illegal occupancy. Martha and Clara came out of the house together, Clara carrying that same canvas bag she'd clutched in the rain 3 months earlier. But now, instead of desperation, both women radiated calm determination. They'd faced this demon before and survived. They weren't about to run again. "Deputy Harrison," Vance called to the officer. "These are the squatters I told you about. I have court orders authorizing immediate removal and demolition of unauthorized structures." The deputy looked around at the clearly well-maintained property, the obviously functional home, and the 2 women who didn't look like squatters in any sense of the word. "Mr. Vance, this doesn't look like an abandoned property to me." That's when Elias walked out of the barn carrying the leather folder of legal documents Torres had prepared. "Deputy," he said calmly, "I'm Elias Morrison, and this is my property. These women are legal residents and business partners. I'd like to see the paperwork authorizing anyone to demolish anything on my land." Vance's confident smile flickered. "The court orders are very specific. About a property in Connecticut that was illegally seized," Clara interrupted, opening her canvas bag and pulling out a collection of documents that made Vance's face go pale. "I've got the original deed to our family farm, tax payment receipts going back 5 years, and affidavits from 3 neighbors who witnessed the fraudulent eviction." Deputy Harrison took the documents from both parties, comparing them carefully. After several minutes, he looked up at Vance with suspicion. "Sir, these Connecticut orders don't give you any authority in Maryland. And these folks have documentation proving legal residency here." "There's been a mistake," Vance began. "The only mistake," Martha said, her voice carrying decades of righteous anger, "is thinking you could steal from us twice." The deputy handed Vance back his papers. "Sir, you need to leave this property immediately. If you have legitimate legal issues with these folks, pursue them through proper channels. But you've got no authority here, and that bulldozer is trespassing." Vance's mask of civilized authority finally slipped, revealing the predator beneath. "This isn't over," he snarled at Martha. "I'll find another way." "No," Elias said quietly. "You won't." He pulled out his phone and showed Vance a recording that had been running since the bulldozer arrived. "I've got everything you just said on tape, including your admission that this is harassment. My lawyer's going to love this." As Vance and his equipment retreated down the gravel drive, Deputy Harrison tipped his hat to the 3 of them. "Folks like that give legitimate business a bad name," he said. "You ever have trouble with him again, you call the state police directly." That night, the 3 partners sat on the restored front porch, watching stars emerge in a clear sky. Martha rocked gently in the swing that Elias had finally gotten around to fixing, while Clara updated their business projections on her laptop. "Rebecca thinks we can file criminal charges against Vance," Clara said. "Wire fraud, racketeering, conspiracy. The whole 9 yards. Martha nodded approvingly. "About time someone held that snake accountable." Elias leaned back in his chair, feeling a peace he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. "You know what the best part is?" he said. "We didn't just survive his attack. We're stronger than we were before." 5 years later, the transformation was complete. What had started as Morrison Family Logistics had grown into Travelers Logistics, a regional powerhouse coordinating routes for 37 independent drivers across 6 states. The converted barn buzzed with activity as Clara managed operations with a team of 4 coordinators, while Martha ran the hospitality side, providing meals and temporary housing for drivers transitioning between runs. The Maryland ranch had become legendary in trucking circles as a place where drivers were treated like family instead of just cargo haulers. Martha's Kitchen fed anyone who needed a meal. Clara's logistics network could find profitable routes for drivers who'd been struggling with empty backhauls, and Elias had become something he'd never expected. A mentor to younger drivers trying to build their own businesses. "Granddad Elias!" A voice called across the yard. Elias looked up from the engine he was tuning to see his daughter Emma's 8-year-old son racing toward him, followed closely by Clara's twin toddlers. The children she'd had with the logistics coordinator she'd married 2 years earlier. "Easy there, Jake," Elias called back, but he was grinning as his grandson launched himself into his arms. Emma had started bringing her family for monthly visits once she'd seen how the ranch had transformed from a monument to grief into a celebration of chosen family. Martha emerged from the house carrying a tray of lemonade, her face wrinkled with age but bright with purpose. At 96, she moved more slowly than she once had, but her mind remained sharp as a blade and her heart large enough to encompass every driver who'd found refuge at their table. "Clara's got 3 new drivers joining the network next month," she announced. "And that nice young woman from Virginia wants to bring her children for the summer driving camp." The summer camp had been Martha's idea, a program teaching teenagers basic mechanics and logistics skills while their parents completed long-haul runs. It had become so popular they were booked solid through the next year. As evening settled over the ranch, Elias stood on the porch that had once been his place of solitude and watched 3 generations of his chosen family settling in for another night. Clara was helping Jake with his math homework while her husband played with the toddlers. Martha was teaching Emma's teenage daughter how to bake bread, and Emma was deep in conversation with 2 drivers about expanding the camp program. The storm that had brought Martha and Clara into his life felt like a lifetime ago, but Elias could still remember the exact moment when he'd seen 2 figures walking in the rain and had to choose between safety and compassion. That single decision, to stop when every instinct told him to keep driving, had transformed not just his own life, but created ripples of change that were still spreading. His phone buzzed with a text from Deputy Harrison, who'd become a friend over the years. "Saw the news about Vance finally getting sentenced. 20 years federal prison. Justice served." Elias smiled and deleted the message. Sterling Vance had become irrelevant the moment they'd chosen to build something together instead of just surviving separately. The real victory wasn't putting a predator in prison. It was proving that sometimes the best family is the one you choose, and the strongest home is the one built on mutual respect, shared purpose, and the radical belief that everyone deserves a place to belong. Subscribe to see how this unfolds and comment where you're watching from. I will love to say hello to you just to know how far our story is going.